Problem with
Christianity
Christianity.
is
Problem with
Christianity.
Problem with
Christianity.
Christianity
My problem
Problem with
with
Christianity is they just want to take the fun out of everything.
The problem with Christianity is
The
just
problem
all
with
it is.
Christianity is that I know Christians
The
that
problem
don't
with
live out what they
Christianity is
say.
that it's so
Exclusive. How can
judgmental
only
towards
Christians
sexual
show it?
orientation.
Allow death and destruction
How can it be
and
the only
war
way?
in our world.
Would a loving God really send that many people to hell?
It's no different than Greek
The problem with
mythology.
Christianity is you can't scientifically
How do you know
prove
God's
God.
real? How do you know God's real?
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you guys this morning. It's a rainy fall day out there. It's official now, kids. It's sad in the Pacific Northwest. We actually start to feel a little at home in that. It's so weird. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, finally the rain came. It got cold. Leaves are dying. This is so good. All right, so it's the weirdest deal. But we are starting off a brand new series today, The Problem with Christianity. And I wanted to start this off this morning with a couple of just quick little things, and then I'm going to pray and we'll get right to business. The first is, if you're a guest with us today, this is your first time, I'm really grateful you're here and grateful that you're here for this series, because I think it's going to be a useful series and an honest series and a reflective series. And so that's one thing. The other is, if you're a guest, either watching or present in the room with us today, and you would say, I'm not a Christian, right? I'm in part coming because I have some problems with Christianity, and I want to hear how this church addresses those problems. I want to just say thank you for taking the time to make that investment. You could do any number of things today, and you could do any number of things instead of watch this video online, but you're stopping and wanting to be kind of open-minded to say, I just want to see what they're about. So I'm really excited about that. The other thing I want you to know is that we won't be able to cover everything every single Sunday. I just don't have the time for that. I would love to have you all pack a sack lunch and we just go for hours on end. But that's not the way it's going to work. So instead, what we're doing is we're going to give you the opportunity. In fact, there's a slide for our Everyday Missionary podcast. This is a podcast we do every week. And throughout the series, this number is going to be on the screen. And as you're listening and you have a question, you can just text the question that you have into that number. And then on Monday morning, I'm going to go in, answer those questions in our podcast. That will then go online Tuesday morning. And we try to address some of those things. And no questions off limits. All right, so even if you go like, this sounds like a snarky question, or this is a really hard one, or this is a sensitive one, we want to address those in that podcast. So don't hesitate. Feel free to text any question you have. Like I said, every slide that comes up, that number is always going to be there, so it'll perpetually be on display for you to use. And man, we're all about cell phones here. You can use your cell phone. We have a little app, and in the app we have notes. You can follow along in the notes, or you can just have your text ready in case you're ready to do something. So anything is cool with that. Other than that, I'm going to pray, and I'm going to ask this morning and throughout the series if I can have some people just praying for me through this series, just some hands on that. Thank you. I really appreciate that. That's going to help me a ton because, man, we're dealing with some crazy stuff. All right, so with all that said, I'm going to briefly pray, and we're going to get right underway. Jesus, I thank you for this opportunity to hopefully show insight and compassion and goodwill and thoughtful intention to wanting to answer great questions and sincere criticisms when it comes to the Christian faith. And so I ask that you would just bless. I ask that you would help me to be wise and not dumb, and to be thoughtful and not careless in my words. And so we ask for your kindness today in your good name. Amen. So this series was born a while back in my head and heart and everything else, and part of it was just acknowledging the fact that we live in a time that feels very divided, right? You don't have to look far to see the division. You have ethnic division right now in some circles. You have social division, economic division, and then certainly we see sort of this division that kind of stems even from politics, left versus right, traditional versus kind of more progressive, and from that there's all of this rift going on. And I think one of the places where that rift is most pronounced is even in the realm of religion and secularism, right? And there's this sense of kind of polarization and posturing that happens in that context, especially when you notice things in the media or on social media. There is this constant kind of upspin of the divide between those two groups. And one of the things I think it's important to understand about that divide is that both sides in that divide feel legitimately threatened. They feel threatened at times. Both sides do. It's not like we feel threatened and they think they have control. No, both sides feel threatened. And you hear it, again, in things like the war on Christmas, or the war on science, or the war on women, or the war on religious liberty. Like, both sides feel like there's this war on them from the other side. And so there's this constant polarization, this constant tension, this constant sense of, if we're in a war, then I need to posture, I need to think combatively when it regards the other side. And we've seen that increase in our society. My heart for this series is to disrupt all of that. My heart for this series is to have a certain level of intellectual honesty around all of the discussions that we're going to have throughout the course of the next couple of months. And in there, my heart is really to find somewhat of a third way through the divide. In fact, if anything, while this series is what's called an apologetic series, and I'm going to define that word in a minute, but while it's that, more importantly, I'm going to call it a rehumanizing series. I want us to rehumanize these conversations. Not so it's like, here's a good zinger, got the other side, but rather, how can we have dialogue? How can we have interchange and expression? And again, this sense of goodwill investment into one another, even where we differ and disagree. I think that's going to be a valuable exercise in the context of all of this, because it's so easy in the current world to demonize one side and almost blindly idolize the other side at the cost of humanizing just the complexities of life. And I'm saying that in part this morning to us in the Christian sphere. I'm not saying this to those who are maybe concerned about or fearful of Christianity. I'm saying it to us. There's this great little Bible verse that a guy named Peter wrote. He said, judgment begins in the house of God. It begins in the church. Right? True, wise, good judgment is us stepping back and saying, as Christians, are there some things we need to refine or polish? Because I think historically, when Christianity had a lot more sway within society, we had a lot more voice, more people were church-going people, we would have a tendency to say right things, but with a wrong tone, and ultimately that was a wrong approach. And from that, we lost some of our ability to have positive influence within the culture. We became a little bit more threatening to the culture, or at least it was perceived that we were in some ways threatening, and so all the more there's been this divide and rift. And so this morning is a message for those of us in the room that would be Christians. And in that, though, it is a tone-setting message that if you're not a Christian in the room or you're not a Christian watching online, we know a lot of people are probably going to watch because they're curious about this topic. This is a tone setter that I think non-Christians will go, oh, I see what Christians are trying to do and trying to adapt to and trying to learn while still holding to their convictions and beliefs. See, I believe, as we look at the topic today, that this first topic is critical to all the different ways that people see problems with Christianity, because they see a lot of problems, right? If we're just honest, they go, here's a problem, there's a problem, everywhere's a problem, so how do we kind of address the problems? Well, it starts with the first problem. And the first problem that we have to be honest about is our approach. Our approach. That we have to think through who it is we're approaching and how the best way we can approach those people is, what we can really do to make that effective. Now, the place I want to start here then this morning is to define our word apologetics. I mentioned that I would give you the definition. I think that's a good launch point because I want to build out what I'm getting at in the use of this word. Now, the word apologetics, big fancy word, comes from a Greek word, apologia, which means a defense. A defense. And here's the definition. It is a reasoned argument, defense, or explanation of something, typically a theory or a religious doctrine. Now, that seems pretty straightforward, but like I said, my heart is to humanize how we do this, right? And so in this, we have to stop and say, all right, if I'm to give a defense or an explanation, it's a defense or an explanation of what? And what I mean by this is, what is the question being asked? What is the concern? What is the criticism? What is the critique? Ready? What is the fear that somebody who's not a Christian may have of us as Christians? Like, we have to slow down, and before we're just ready to blow answers out into the world, which is sometimes what we do, especially on social media, we have to stop and say, wait, but what are the questions? See, I say that because sometimes we're so quick to drive an answer, we haven't stopped and said, is anybody even asking this question? Right? Because we may have answers for questions that nobody is asking. Or we may have answers that are giving in ways that are so barbed or so loaded or so Christian-esque that no one can actually understand or hear them. They can't receive the answers. There's too much baggage that comes immediately with the response, and that's one of the challenges. Or sometimes what we fail to do in the questioning is hear the deeper question under the question. Or to be honest, I think sometimes we just give dumb answers, right? They're kind of like straw man answers that even we're like, it kind of stinks, but give it, why not? It's just like, that's the risk. Now, in that, I want to be really clear with my fellow Christians in the room. I believe in the marketplace of ideas that the message of Jesus found in the Bible is the best option for life. I absolutely believe that. In the marketplace of ideas, if somebody said, all right, of all of the options in this world, for me to have the most abundant life possible, what is the best concept in that? I would say, man, you need to look at the message of Jesus. You need to look at the Bible through the lens of what the Bible's seeking to do, which is to bring abundant life. Like, I believe that is the best idea in the marketplace of ideas. At the same time, I don't think we're always great researchers or marketers in the marketplace of ideas as Christians, and so we want to understand how to do this a little bit better. We want to refine the approach. And for our purposes this morning, I think Proverbs chapter 18, this little book of wisdom nuggets, gives us some direction to navigate by. In Proverbs chapter 18, verse 13, it says this: to answer before listening, that is folly and it is shame. See, apologetics is to answer, but before you do that, it's the first thing in your notes. If you're taking notes this morning, our approach must be to listen. Before we give an answer, we need to slow down and just pay attention and listen to what people are actually saying. And here's what I want to be clear about. There is a difference, ready? If you're taking notes, write this down. There's a difference between hearing and listening. There's a huge difference. If you've raised teenagers, you know. Right? You're talking to them and they're rolling their eyes and everything. They're hearing. You can tell with the roll of the eyes and the body language, but they're not listening. Right? And if you're a teenager with parents, you know the same thing. Right? You're like, they don't ever listen to me. They just hear me. Right? So, same thing. We've all been in that place. The difference between hearing and listening is very simple. Hearing is about, all right, what's that one word you're going to say that I disagree with so I can give a rebuttal to whatever it is you're saying? That's to hear. To listen is to say, I want to get your heart. I want to understand where you're coming from. I want to kind of listen below the surface. That's the spirit. I want to understand your position, not just hear your words. Now, here's why I say all of that. Recently, the Pew Research Group did some research on those who grew up in a religious background and left it. We call them the nons or nuns, right? They check none in the religious affiliation box. But most of these grew up in a Christian context. And so they've done some different research things over the last 2 years, but the one from 2016 was interesting because instead of just like, where do you fall in a 1 through 5 or check which box applies, they said, please fill in the blank. Why did you leave Christianity, or why did you leave your religious affiliation? I want you to listen right now. Don't hear. Hear is to say, oh, well, I can point out why that's wrong, that way that's broken, but I want you to listen to some of these responses. So why did you leave religion to the church? One person said, well, once I went to college and learned about evolution, everything else just went to the wayside. I left religion and church because too many Christians were just doing unchristian things. I left because there's a lack of scientific or specific evidence for a creator. I left because I see organized religious groups as more divisive than unifying. I no longer believe in organized religion. I don't attend services anymore. I just believe that religion is very personal. This one person said, because I think religion is not religion anymore, it's more of a business. It's all about money, and so I saw no reason to stay. I left because of the church's teaching on homosexuality. I left because of the clergy sex abuse scandal. I left because I feel like there's something out there, but I can't really nail it down with religion. Right now in my life, I'm kind of leaning towards spirituality, but I'm not too sure. I know I can pray to my God anywhere. I do believe in a higher power, but I don't need church to do that. I guess I just basically stopped going to church when I went to college and they never picked it up again. I guess I was never super religious. Or as one person said, just nowadays, I just don't have a lot of time to go to church. Now, if you were listening to all of that, here's what you're going to notice. For some people, the issue was an information issue. There's not enough facts to prove that there's a God. For others, though, it wasn't information, it was organization. I look at religion and it's corrupt in its institutions. Some said it's a relevance problem. I just don't see how it's useful for today. Others said it's an independence problem. Religion tries to control you. None of us want to live in the handmaiden's tale, all right? So it's theocracy, and I don't want to be a part of that. But for some, it was simply a schedule issue. I have better things to do with my time. And then for some, it was a press issue. They believe the press, whatever the press may say about religion or the church, and they trust those sources. And from that, they go, this is why I'm not a part anymore. Here's what I'm getting at with all of that. People live on a spectrum. They live on this spectrum. And some are on the spectrum of, man, I'm an atheist and I'm militant and I'm going to troll anybody that's a person of faith and I'm going to let them know why they're stupid online. You're going to get those types of people. That's true. Just as much on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to get like weird militant religious people that are just highly offensive online, and they're the other trolls to those trolls, right? But then there's all this in between. You've got agnostics of different flavors, atheists of different flavors, spiritual people of different flavors, different religions of different flavors. And then even as Christians, we have to admit we live on a spectrum too, right? We have our own doubts at times. Sometimes we're really good about obeying the Bible. Other times we're not really good about obeying it. Sometimes we're like, I could use my time differently, so I don't go to church because I'd rather do these things. We're no different than the other people who don't go at all because they could use their time different. Everybody is on a spectrum. See, here's why, to me, as we're trying to understand this is important. 3 things you need to know about this as Christians. First of all, there are flavors of skepticism. There's just flavors of skepticism. So we shouldn't put everybody in a box. Oh, atheist, agnostic, other religion, spiritual, us. Right? It's not that simple, necessarily. And so we have to interact at that level that says, all right, there are flavors. The second thing we have to understand in this, if you really listened, is that most skepticism is sincere. It's as sincere as your own faith. If somebody says, man, I just don't understand this, I don't get that, I'm trying to put the pieces together, and I've just got a lot of questions, and it doesn't make sense to me, really in a lot of ways, it's because they've never come in contact with an answer that is sufficient enough or satisfying enough to move them from where they're at to another part of the spectrum. And you have to treat that as sincere. It's way too easy to almost see it as a lack of sincerity or that everybody else is, just playing a game to try to mess with us as Christians. No, there's an honesty in this process that people have legitimate different concerns and fears and critiques and criticisms and questions. And being, human in that is healthy. But also in this, we have to realize that inside the skepticism, there's one part an information issue, but then there's also one part an issue of disposition in the giving of the information, right? So they're not just wanting to hear our answer, they're wanting to hear our heart in the answer. So I'm going to give you an illustration of this so you can understand how you're trying to listen for their heart as they're asking a question. So you may have a friend, a relative, whatever else, and they say, all right, you go to church, you're a Christian, what's the deal with Christians and their approach and seemingly opposition to homosexuality? What's with Christians and homosexuality? Now, you could look and go, well, there's a big question there. I would offer you there are 2 questions there. There is the question, and then there is the question underneath the question. And the question underneath the question, ready? I want you to catch this, is more critical to the person than the question being asked. See, the question asked is a very simple question. What's the deal with Christians and homosexuality? The question below the question is, when you answer that question, what is your tone? What is your heart? What is your disposition? So if you answer that question and it's cold, you've answered their deeper question. Are you compassionate or are you judgmental? Are you phobic or are you kind? Are you coming from a place of informed interaction with others, or are you just parroting something that you heard in some place at some time, and that's just where you're at? Like, they're listening to hear. Are we exuding a spirit of humility in the answering, or are we, again, just abrasive and sharp, and we don't seem to give any dignity to the question? Because if we answer in a way that just has this kind of to it, right? They will hear you, but they will not listen to you, right? Because they need to know that there is something undergirding you with a sympathy and a dignity in the answering. It needs to be in there, right? Now, can you have that conversation and yet still have compassion? Can you be somebody that would be considered a more traditional or more historically orthodox Christian and have that? You absolutely can. I have proof of that. Some of you know I have an adult gay son. We talk about this stuff. We do. And we love each other, and we understand each other, and we show respect toward one another, and we have dignity in the process of the conversation, and we honor one another in that, and we really enjoy each other's company in that. And you know what that's called? That's called tolerance. The healthiest, right kind, where you go, hey, we can have things where we may see the world differently at times, but boy, I can so love you, and so invest into you, and so answer in a way that understands the complexities of things, right? That's the spirit that we want to embody, because here's the deal: how we say something is just as critical as what we say. And you all know it. If somebody says something to you in a way that's less than kind, it's tough to hear what they're saying. It's just tough. And so that's what we want to be about as followers of Jesus. We want to get where they're coming from, understand where they're at, and then move forward from there. Now, if I took this a little bit deeper, here's what I'd say. They ask a question. In our mind, we instantly have an answer. With that, we try to couple it to emotions that are empathetic, caring, humble, gracious, kind, right? These key words. But here's where I want to take it a step deeper and get us to think a little bit more. Instead of having a back pocket answer with the right kind of disposition for it, here's what we want to do. When the question is asked and an answer pops into our head, before we answer the question, you ready? It's real simple. Have another better question. They ask a question, and before you answer, have another better question. I call this graciously interested apologetics. Graciously interested apologetics. And by the way, this is not a trick. This is not a gimmick. This is not some tactic. It's saying, I want to understand where this person's fully coming from. I want to fully listen before I answer. So a person says, what's the deal with Christians and homosexuality? And before you have an answer, you go, that's a really good question. I'm kind of curious, like, what has been your experience with that? What's the issue with Christians and homosexuality? You know, I'm interested. I mean, just what do you think our position is? Right? Asking a follow-up question. This has tremendous value. I was thinking about this in my own life because of the story of having a gay son. So let's say I wasn't a pastor, and I was looking for a church. And I'm an evangelical, right? I'm still an evangelical. I believe the Bible's the Word of God. I'm not taking any issue with the Bible or anything else, but I'm going to go to a church, and I'm going to ask that church, hey, what's this church's position on homosexuality? And if I sit down with the leadership and they go, oh, you know what, we think there's this gay agenda and it's trying to corrupt our kids and it's driving everything and we need to stand against it and we're going to have a boycott next week and da-da-da-da-da. You know what? That answer tells me everything I need to know. That I could never bring my son to church to be exposed to my Christian faith. Right? You would feel alienated, out of place. Right? My son is not a confessing Christian, though he is very, very supportive of our Christian family and Christian faith. He's just not there. But that would not be a place I could take my son. Because again, even though we could look at the Bible and we would see the Bible in a lot of the same ways, the way they're saying it, man, they wouldn't get it. If they were to say all of that, and then I'd be like, oh, okay. And they go, well, why do you ask? Well, because my adult son, who I'd love to bring with me to church, is gay. But that answer lets me know he could never be welcome. He would never be loved here. You know? He would never be given the space to wrestle or the space to think or the space to interact with God or the Bible or the Holy Spirit. It would be so hard for him to listen. He would just be hearing. This is why I'm saying these things are valuable, that we slow down to listen, to hear people's heart. See, when you do this, when you have this graciously interested apologetic, what you're doing is you're entering into the other person's experience in life. Because you know what, like that same topic, you might say, well, why do you ask? And they go, because my best friend grew up in a Christian home and they were gay and they came out and their family kicked them out and they committed suicide 3 months later. Knowing that will shape how you answer. Right? Before you go online and posting something crazy, you got to remember people have stories behind some of their fears and frustrations and concerns about Christianity. It's not as binary as these like kind of abstract conversations that are in a bubble without life experience. And so there's value in listening, so you enter into their experience. The other thing is that it creates the ability to have dialogue and not simply debate. And what you're doing as you listen is you're listening for their perspective on your perspective. Right? They already have probably a preconceived idea of where you're coming from, and in that you get to find out where it may fit and where it may not be fully fitting as to what it is you actually believe as a Christian. Right? In fact, I'd seen this model in business and church leadership, but I thought it applied to this one. Maybe we're sitting down with somebody that's concerned about Christianity, critiques, whatever. As you're listening to the follow-up question, why do you ask? Or what do you think? What you're listening for is where is it right? What they're saying is spot on, that's true. But also, where is it maybe wrong? Not like you're saying they're wrong, but they're reflecting what maybe they think we think, and you go, that's not what we think. And so you go, I can listen to that and go, can I talk about that part? I'm not sure that's quite what we think, but I get where you've maybe picked that up. Then you go, what's missing in that? Because there may be an incomplete thought, or even what's confusing. But the heart behind this is that you're getting their position so that then you can offer up your position, but you're giving your position with God's ambition. Your position with God's ambition. What's God's ambition? Little snippet from a book called Romans, a letter that Paul writes to a group of people in a very non-Christian context. But he knows the challenge of religion, and religion is awesome at being judgmental and forgetting the very grace that it proclaims. And so he begins to warn about being judgmental as religious people. And then he says this. He says, do you not see how wonderfully kind and tolerant and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sins? There's this thing in God in which there's kindness and there's tolerance and there's this graciousness and patience with us. And this is exactly the way we as Christians should be within our society. It doesn't mean we don't have thoughts, convictions, beliefs, opinions, whatever else. But boy, those should flow from a disposition like this. Getting questions, asking more questions to get people's heart. You know who was awesome at this was Jesus. He was awesome at it. People would come and ask Jesus a question, and immediately he would respond with a question. Before he gave the answer, he'd respond to the question. And the core of that is it revealed the person's heart, right? And sometimes there was a lack of sincerity. They were just there to trap him. But other times it was sincere. And with the sincerity, it exposed more of where they were coming from. And from that, Jesus could then speak into that scenario. And that's exactly what we have the opportunity to do as well, to be like Jesus, to go below the surface, to have the sonar on, and to really hear from people where they're at. Because only when we've listened are we then equipped to do the second thing in your notes, respond. Our approach first needs to be to listen, but then our approach must be to respond. We do need to say something. Nobody ever said, I'm going to consider Christianity by just interacting with a person that just nods. Right? Like something finally has to come out of our face, right? So like words must be spoken, right? And so we have to be in that space, right? We have to string together a cogent thought. Not so we can say, I told them, but so they can say, I heard them, right? So in this, I think the response has to have 4 parts. First part in your notes, it's 1 part articulation. It's articulation. In other words, we have to have a reasoned and reasonable answer to whatever the questions are, right? We have to have a reason and reason, which means, you know what? We need to do some homework. If we took the top 10 biggest concerns about Christianity or challenges or critiques, would we have some kind of answer to give if asked? I mean, we might have to do a little homework. If you're in some of our small groups called regroups, and you're going to go through the series every single week, the first 2 questions are learning how to listen and then coming up with really thoughtful, reasoned, reasonable answers. I mean, at some point we have to do that, but because we've listened first. The second thing about this is that in the answering, it's not like you're going to find one answer that answers everything. It's not like one ring to rule them all. There's not one answer, right? It's like all this little aggregate. Like I go back to, in my own Christian faith, it's not any one thought that makes me go, I think this is the best, most reasonable idea in the marketplace of ideas. It's many thoughts strung together that kind of sells me on this whole thing. And in that, you might even find that, some great ways to respond is, Christianity brings some things to the human condition that nobody had ever thought of before. Things like human dignity and justice and sense of independence and things like governance that we, the people, kind of comes out of what God said in Deuteronomy. And there's all these things where we can say, secularism grabbed things that really are borrowed from our Christian faith. These ideas were there a long time before they were considered to be secular ideas. They're helpful and useful to human flourishing, and maybe that's the way you approach it. But also in this, in the articulation, I think there needs to be this part of us also that says, and I don't know everything. And I'm not fully sure how to answer that. And I'm still growing, and I'm still learning. And yeah, maybe there's been some things that we could do better. In fact, in James, he says this. He says, the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, and then it says this, open to reason. Wow, reason's in the Bible. Open to reason. It's full of mercy and good fruits. It's impartial and it's sincere. So while it's 1 part articulation, it's also the second thing, it's 1 part authenticity. It's authenticity. As we interact with people, we say, yeah, I have my own hang-ups at times. I have my own doubts. There was this one guy that came to Jesus. He had a son that was sick and suffering, and Jesus says, you believe I can heal him? He says, I believe, but help my unbelief. And be like, that's some of us as Christians. We believe, but sometimes we struggle with belief. That's a good thing to admit. That's authentic. Another good thing is when somebody says, the history of Christianity is riddled with, violence and this and that, and we go, you know what? You're right. Sometimes apologetics is apology. That's true. I'm not going to say it isn't true. There's modern sins among us as Christians, and we should be like, yep, that's totally true. We should be consistent with our ethics. So when it's not, because here's the problem sometimes, we get so political about stuff, and when it's not our guy and he's unethical, we freak out. When it's our guy and he's unethical, we're a little bit more protective, defensive, and we excuse things. That doesn't help anybody. That's not sincere and impartial. That's biased. And so we have to think in terms of authenticity. This leads into the third thing. It's 1 part attitude. And that's really what the first point was all about. Listening, caring, empathizing is about attitude. You know what people can't stand? Jerks. Unless it's our jerks. Right? This is part of the problem. We like our jerks and we don't like their jerks. Case in point, when Richard Sherman was our jerk, right? We loved our jerk. He was our jerk. But now he's the 49ers jerk. We don't like that jerk, right? So, same thing in the Christian sphere. Right? If our attitude in any way comes across as sort of this judgmental or arrogant or prudish or looking down our nose or thinking we're better than others, if we come across in that spirit, people just go, well, those guys are jerks. And nobody likes a jerk unless it's their own jerk. And we're not their jerks, so we're just jerks, right? Reality is a bad attitude can destroy a brilliant answer. A bad attitude can destroy a brilliant answer. And for us as Christians, we need to confirm, or not confirm, rather we need to disrupt stereotypes. We need to get away from confirming stereotypes. And we need to disrupt the stereotypes that may be there. Proverbs 15:1 says this, a soft word, that will turn away aggression, frustration, violence, anger, fear. But a harsh word, it's going to spin it up, right? It's going to unleash more of that. And so our disposition must be the display of the proof of our Christian faith. And the display of this is seen in Galatians chapter 5. It says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's what people should see. I almost did a thing this week on social media, and then I stopped being stupid. Right? It's always good to have like fail-safes. Would an idiot do this thing? If an idiot would do this thing, I will not do that thing, right? Dwight Schrute, totally. So I kind of stopped, but I was going to put on social media, Christianity is blank. Thought I'm just going to find out. And part of it was to go, I'm curious if anybody that are my non-Christian friends would list anything in the fruit of the Spirit, even remotely close. I would even give them like some leeway, like they're okay sometimes. Like, okay, I'll take it. You know, like what would be the response to fill in the blank? And I go, this is where maybe we have a little bit more homework to do, so that we again can get behind the idea that, you know what, our disposition should be clearly seen. Clearly seen, at least in the circles of people that we know. I get people that we don't know. We all run to stereotypes. All of us do. Every single one of us runs to stereotypes. I get that. But in our sphere, it should be like, again, we're the disruptors. Like, oh, you're not like most evangelicals. How is that? Or you're not like most Christians. How is that? And it's like, okay, and then that's healthy. That you can be like, well, here's, I think most Christians are like this more than not, but then you can go down the road with some other things. But boy, we should display this disposition. And all of this is going to come to the final part. It's also one part action. Notice how it ends with self-control. That bleeds into the fact that our lives should match up with what it is we believe and what it is we say. In other words, our lives and lifestyle is the best or worst apologetic. It is the best or the worst, right? Because people are going to measure, are you a satisfied customer, right? If you see a product that has 5 stars on Amazon, everybody's giving it 5 stars, you're like, oh, I need that. Prime, boom, buy now. What's not going to get here in 2 days? Right? So, like, we freak out, first world problem, right? So, 5 stars, though, I know that that's a good product. If I see like 1.5 stars, and people are taking pictures of like jacked up products and stuff, I'm like, I'm not buying that, right? Right? So the proof is in the presentation of whatever it is. And so in the same way, we as Christians, man, our actions, our lifestyle, that proves or disproves the kind of authenticity of our shared faith. See, these 4 points all come together like a Voltron for Jesus, all right? 1 Peter, familiar passage. It's like the source verse for apologetics for Christians. He says this, in your heart, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense, apologia, there's our word, to anyone who asks for a reason for the hope that is within you. Yet do so with gentleness and respect, having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered by those who revile your good behavior in Christ, they might be put to shame. All 4 things are embedded into that verse. Articulation, you give a reason, you give a defense. Authenticity, hope, honor, conscience. You have an attitude, gentleness, and respect. And you have an action which is good behavior that can't be condemned by an outsider. All of that is in that section. And that is how we are to approach our society. In fact, that takes us to the third thing. Our approach must be approachable. It must be approachable. We as Christians, we're called to go. So we approach others. And yet we should live in such a way that we can be easily approached by others, so that they can inquire, so that they can try to understand, that they can kind of poke and probe, and we don't have a negative response, but rather we lean in and we love regardless, so that we can help others maybe approach God if they're beginning to feel interested or curious or whatever else. I opened by saying the world is divided, right? But Jesus said something to his followers before he left the globe. And he said it many times, but the fundamental core of it was, I'm giving you peace so that you can go and make peace. You're peacemakers. Right? He goes, I want you to go and make that your priority. And so what that means for us as followers of Jesus, as Christians, is that we need to be bridges more than we're weapons. Right? Wow, Jesus is making his presence known in the rain right now. It means we need to stand in gaps and not simply drive the fissures of our society. We need to have faith that inspires. We shouldn't leverage fear that manipulates. We need to be hospitable more than we are formidable, and we need to be attractive more than we're authoritarian. Here's what I've been thinking about more. As Christians, we need to basically live an alternative lifestyle. We're an alternative lifestyle. We're providing this other way of doing life, and we think it is the best idea in the marketplace of ideas. But we're putting it out there like that, like, hey, here's an idea. Here's an alternative to the way things are. So maybe you have a friend and you say, hey, what do you believe? And they go, well, I'm an agnostic. And you say, well, how's that working? And they go, it's awesome. I love it. You go, hey, that's cool. Right? Let's just chill. And then you keep living it. But you might find you say, hey, what do you believe? And they go, well, I don't really have anything. I don't fit anywhere, and I'm not sure what I am and everything else. And you go, well, how's that working for you? And they go, I don't know. I'm starting to ask questions. You're like, hey, I've got an alternative. Right? Maybe think about this. Just put it out there. See, back in the day, we used to be able to say, well, the Bible says. But nowadays, it's like that's not an authority source for most people. That's like saying, green eggs and ham says. It's like, probably has more authority, actually, for a lot of people. So instead, what we're presenting is, just putting it out there. Here's this alternative that I think if you considered it, you'd find that there are some real reasonable things behind it and some good thoughts and some things that maybe it would actually bring something into your life that's very different. I was just talking to somebody this week who was talking about how they went from a decade of atheism into believing, and it was just, again, there was just discouragement in life, and I was looking for an alternative, and Christianity totally fit the bill. And it took me out of my depression. It was an alternative to what was happening. And it was a welcome alternative. That's the way we should approach it. And can I tell you what our big alternative is in this? You're like, okay, how do we alternative lifestyle? What's the big alternative? Ready? It's a weird word. It's this crazy thing. It is our brand. It's called grace. Grace is the alternative. Did you know that all other systems, all worldviews, all philosophies, all come back to the same fundamental place, which is you need to produce, you need to perform, you need to know, you need to grow, you need to do to be accepted. Religious or non-religious, it doesn't even matter, right? I mean, in religions, you have Buddhism, which is if you don't become more detached from the materialism of this world, you're coming back as like a rock, So you better transcend. Right? And in other world religions, you have to do this and you have to comport to that, and these are your works and these are your duties. And even completely non-religious, you have to perform, you have to fit this worldview, and if you don't, you'll be rejected by that view. So all of these are the code in our view, and if you disrupt that code, you may not fit into our group anymore, and so you might be looking for a constant group. We Christians have fallen victim to the same bad stuff sometimes, but at the core of what Jesus communicated, it's grace, and that is different than every other thing. Man, if we could just embody that, live that, that would be our known brand. That would make a huge difference, because what we see in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, it says this. It says, the Word, that's Jesus, became flesh and he dwelt among us. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the only Son from the Father, who is full of grace and truth. Now, I know some Christians will say, oh, but there's truth. And I go, absolutely, it follows grace. Follows grace. When we go, man, I am accepted by the grace of God and not by what I do, that grace is so compelling in my life that I then do what the truth of that grace is, because that's where abundant life is found. Because I enjoy the grace of God in my life. I don't do the truth to earn the grace. I have the grace and do the truth, because it shapes and creates fullness for life. Here's the thing about Christianity that's so interesting to me. Under grace, this alternative, it's God saying to the world, I'm not looking for something from you. I'm looking for something for you. And the more we can communicate that as Christians in our approach, right, the more that I believe that to be compelling. The more it opens up dialogue, it opens up understanding, it opens up friendship. And I look at Jesus, and you know what he was known for? Being a friend of non-religious people, where they were at. And he was so compelling and so attractive that from that they're like, I want what this is, and I want to understand it more. That should be our approach as everyday missionaries. Let's go ahead and pray together. Jesus, I thank you for reminder, for painful truth, for encouraging truth. And I pray that we would live alternative lifestyles, presenting an option that I believe is the best option, the fullest option. Help us as Christians to represent well. And I pray for those who may be with us or watching that are not Christians, that still go, I have a lot of concerns, criticisms, hang up, fear, frustration, hurt maybe. I pray for the next couple of months that we can begin to go into those things and to do it again with a sense of humility and interest and honesty and care and thoughtfulness in you. We thank you, Jesus, in your good name. Amen.